Hello, thank you very much, Kaz and Zoe and Rob. That was a fantastic starter presentation, even if I couldn't see the slides. It covered a lot of ground, and I have to say I agree with all of that. It covered many of the issues, some of the frustrations and challenges, but also a lot of the work that's been done already within the area to try and tackle invasive species. I've been working as a fisheries biologist in Wester Ross over the past 20 years, focusing on fish. So I'm not a specialist on invasive species. And there's lots of other issues which affect wild salmon and sea trout populations. I also have a croft near Gairloch, and I've been battling on the croft with bracken and rushes. That's what crofters are often focused on. But there's also New Zealand flatworms there and ponticum, which is an awfully difficult thing to try and get rid of. So I've got lots to learn. I'm going to try and go through my presentation quite quickly. I've probably got too much here. So next slide, please. So here's a summary. Have you got the summary up of the three things I want to try and focus on? Firstly, just going back a step and looking at some of the biodiversity within Wester Ross that we're trying to protect. I've got a map up here showing the outline. I think you might have seen that already, but there's the big dark green patches, which are the core nature conservation zones, are really precious areas, Benny National Nature Reserve, and the Cunningham woodlands. So I'll say a little bit about some of the invasive species. Other people are going to talk much more about them, but then I want to get on to some of the ideas if I've got time, and we could continue with that this afternoon. Next slide, please. So the landscape, well, a lot of it's uninhabited wilderness. Next slide. With big lochs and small lochs. This is Loch Marie. Next slide, please. There are woodlands. There are woodlands around the coast and bits of woodlands along the gorges of rivers, but because of deer and wildfire, they don't go over much of the ground where they may have been in the past. Next slide, please. This is the headwaters of the Grinnard River, where there's riparian woodland, old alder trees. You can see how they lean out over the river because the deer and the fire can't get to them there. Not many invasive species up there, but maybe one day. So Benny National Nature Reserve, it's the core area for the Wester Ross Biosphere. It's really how the Wester Ross Biosphere got started. There's been a lot of research there and lots of things over the years. A lot of work going on at the moment to try and keep rhododendron out of the area. These are alder trees. But it was set up, next slide please, for the Scots pine forest. Am I keeping up with everybody? Can you see that up on the screen, the pine forest? I haven't heard otherwise, so I'll just keep moving. So it's the core zone. Next slide. There are upland areas which tend to be infertile. Whether they're in a natural state, people argue about that. But the way the ecology works, because of the underlying geology, next slide please, there's a golden eagle in this one. The eagles, the wildlife, the raptors, they're leaving nutrients lying around. And they move nutrients around the area. So the whole ecosystem tends to move the plants, the animals around the area. It's an area which is uninhabited now, but it may have had more people in it in the past. Next slide, please. Well, here's me out in Loch Marie, where I'd like to be spending more time this year once we get through lockdown. Next slide, please. There's some lovely little islands where birds tend to nest. So you get these this small island here, but lots of big islands, which are also part of the core area for the biosphere with the pine woods on them. The poster here that you can see, well, it's focusing on fish. Salmon, sea trout, and Arctic char live in Loch Marie. They're part of a food web, which includes the, next slide, please, the black-throated diver. This picture is actually of black-throated divers in the sea, probably near Gairloch. They feed in the sea, but they nest on the islands in Loch Marie, which is a special protected area for them. Next slide, please. Loch Marie Hotel, which has lots of rhododendrons going round about it, is the centre for a sea trout fishery, which declined about 30 years ago, 20 years ago. One of our challenges is to restore it. So we're interested in the habitats which help to support the insects which support the fish. This is Isle Marie, next slide, pardon me, which is slightly different from the other islands. It's much more fertile. There's a graveyard on the island. Used to do bull sacrifices on the island. There are some larch trees on the island which are non-native. I don't know whether how old they are. There's also rhododendron spreading onto the islands of Loch Marie. It's a wonderful area. The salmon bring in, next slide please, bring in nutrients from the sea. Little Grinnard River is a special area of conservation for Atlantic salmon. This picture was just as it was found in May one year of a salmon jaw which had been left behind by an otter on a little island in the Little Grinnard River. And we've done workshops. I won't explain this in detail, but I note this was done about 15 years ago. I note there's 13 years ago, there's a New Zealand flatworm in the bottom right-hand picture. So I was thinking about them back then, and the mole populations, which I'll come on to slightly later. So we're going to hear more about, next slide please, Atlantic rainforest. I'm really interested in all the mycorrhizal research that's going on at the moment to learn about what the different mycorrhizal fungi do. They're going to get affected as well by rhododendrons and things moving through. And I should think some of you have read this book by Peter Wallenben, The Hidden Life of Trees. What happens when, I don't know whether there's a chapter invasive species in there, I can't remember. It's a wonderful book. So here we are in front of the office in Gairloch for the Fishery Trust, where we go sampling sea trout. I'll say a bit about sea trout in the sea because we've got lots of amazing marine habitats for wildlife and there's lots of food there. I'll move on to the next slide. We sample sea trout because of sea lice, which are a native naturally occurring parasite, but there's huge numbers which infest wild sea trout. Next slide, please. They come off salmon farms. Salmon farming industry is expanding within the Wester Ross area. It's a major challenge for those interested in conserving wild salmon and sea trout fisheries. Salmon escape from fish farms. They could be regarded as an invasive species when they swim up into the natural habitat for the wild salmon. Because genetically they're different, they cause problems for the wild salmon populations and the productivity goes down. At this time, we've just included this one briefly because this is happening this week. The herring are spawning the next week or so off Gairloch on the merle beds. Next slide, please. And the merle beds are regarded as part of an important habitat for the marine, the Wester Ross Marine Protected Area. So we're trying to preserve the merle beds. And in the sea, we've got some islands. This is the island of Longa. It's actually, I stuck this one up, it's fertilized by the birds. It's an area where the sheep graze. It's infested with rats. Some of the other islands around the west of Scotland, the rats have been removed because they've been regarded as invasive species, affecting the seabird breeding success. So here's some sheep. And there are, of course, lots of crofting townships around Wester Ross, where sheep have been the traditional, over the last 100 years or so anyway, one of the main things grown. I've got a croft in this area, and New Zealand flatworms have spread out to affect the grazing areas. And the fertility have gone down. Sorry, that's next slide there. Have we still got the picture up with the Highland cow in it? It's farming in Sutherland. We'll go on to the next slide. The Wester Ross Biosphere Strategic Plan covers a number of things that might have been mentioned earlier. I won't go through them, but we're focusing on the UNESCO sustainability goals, which includes biodiversity conservation. And last year we had a workshop focusing on wildfire. The map there shows the areas that were burnt in 2019 and 2018. There have been some big wildfires already this year. So that's another problem, along with invasive species, which affects biodiversity within the Wester Ross Biosphere. Next slide, please. That's the wildfire workshop. We'll go on to the next one. So moving on to some of the invasive species that I've had some knowledge of and some experience. We've talked a bit about ponticum already and some of the other plants, New Zealand flatworms. I'll just say a little bit about them because they're all going to get covered in other parts of this conference. So there's Invasive in green. There's lots of invasive species that have inhabited that can be found around this sort of area. Not all relating to Invasive gardens, but quite a few of them are relating to the big houses in the gardens as original sources. Next slide, please. 12 years ago, there was a lot of interest in finding a non-chemical method of controlling rhododendron ponticum, and James Merriweather was one of the biggest enthusiasts. Next slide, please. And invited up Donald Kennedy and Gordon French to do a training course. We worked with them at National Trust for Scotland in Review, and Rob's in the picture there, and Babs McRitchie and one or two other people who may be listening in at the moment. So there's been quite a lot of work over the years, fantastic work to try and get rid of ponticum. There's still a lot of places, though, where you find these isolated bushes out in the hill. That's Doug Bartholomew, who's the site manager at Berry National Nature Reserve. He uses a mattock, and that's a pretty powerful way of getting through some of the areas. I'll say a bit more later. But we need to tackle these isolated bushes. Here's the youth hostel, which I cycled past on my way to work. It's been there's been just a single bush there that's been treated with stem injection, although there's some layering that's gone on. There's lots of seedlings on the hillside roundabout. They just need to be pulled out over several years after the main job has been done. Eamon may mention that slide. It's a bird hide at Loch Marie Hotel. It looks out over the loch, but it had the poster up about Scots pine inside, Scots pine woodland, but the view was completely obscured by rhododendrons that grew up following an initial rhododendron control initiative about 20 years ago. And Rob's already talked about the Japanese knotweed on the river broom, so I'll flip through that. So that's the next slide. And another one on rhododendron, sorry, on Japanese knotweed on the river broom. That's John Parrott, who was very involved with Rob and the local proprietors to control the Japanese knotweed along the river broom. Next slide, please. Skunk cabbage is one which grows amongst lots of other invasive species at Tourneg. It's come out of a big house overlooking a loch. The house has been unoccupied for quite a long time, so it requires other action to try and keep on top of it. And here's another one that's growing around Melvig, Gunnera. There's a few Gunnera plants appearing now. I'm interested in how to get rid of the Gunnera. I spend more time though battling bracken. So in the Outer Hebrides, Gunnera is an increasing problem, and I think already Scottish Natural Heritage have put some money towards trying to control it. So there's one of several species. We've heard about Montbretia, Cosmea. There's another one that's spreading in Wester Ross, Alchabilla molli, that's coming along the verges. So there's quite a few that are potentially going to be problems in future years. Hogweed, giant hogweed, is fortunately rare within Wester Ross area at the moment. This is the only plant that I found, and it just stopped the car and smashed it to pieces rather than doing anything else. It hasn't reappeared. That was 4 or 5 years ago. So I think it must have just been a couple of seeds in a favourable place for it to grow. Right, New Zealand flatworms. They've been spread from garden centres, and they were probably 30 years ago. They must have arrived within the area. So in many areas where there are houses, they've been spreading for a number of years, just steadily out from the gardens into surrounding croftland and woodland. And there's really very little that you can do about it once it arrives. I'm interested because it seems to extirpate the moles. On the next slide, please. The moles at Melvig disappeared over the past 10 years on the last crofts at Melvig as the New Zealand flatworms, I think, spread through the area. Now, I say I think because I don't understand all the links between flatworms, earthworm species, and how the moles have spread. So Brian Brogue, he did a lot of work looking and predicted what the losses would be to grassland productivity. He's been largely correct at Melvig. Next slide, please. You can find that on the internet.
Just Peter, so that's 15 minutes.
Yeah, okay, I'll try and keep going quickly. Just go through the flatworms. There's native wildlife may eat some of them, but not enough. Next slide, please. Mink, we're going to hear about that later. So next slide, please. I'm curious because we have pine martens, we have foxes and eagles around. I'm wondering if it's possible for water voles to survive in areas where after mink have arrived without control. I don't know what the end game is with mink at the moment in Wester Ross, because there'll be lots of initiatives, the numbers get knocked back, then they recover again. So we're going to have to just keep at it for a number of years. So there is an updated biosecurity plan forthcoming. I've seen the draft of this, so I'm sure it's something to go out to consultation, and we can have a look to see how much of it's going to be of relevance for the future. So there's lots of lessons that we've learned. Rob said most of this already. Need to follow up the gains that have been made over past years, but the strategic approach is very important. The government has got to invest much more in a longer-term strategic approach rather than short-term project funding. So we need to get more local support, more awareness and local support from local people, and get them sort of taking a sense of ownership of the areas that they consider to be most valuable, and an all-species approach, and be able to respond in a flexible way to local concerns. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I'll stop there. I've got some ideas which I can maybe present this afternoon. Thanks very much.